The transition from the Republic to the Empire in the Star Wars Legends continuity was not an immediate, clean break. The Empire contained some vestiges of the Republic in some ways, like the Senate, which we see at the end of its decline in Episode 4, but this also goes the other way, with some of the Empire's more insidious, not to be confused with Darth Sidious, elements coming into existence under the Republic as well, especially during the Clone Wars. And today we're going to look at the Republic origins of one of the most Darth Sidious Imperial organizations of them all, COMPNOR. COMPNOR, or the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, existed under the Empire as a kind of catch-all propaganda, intelligence, and paramilitary group within the government. Anything which could have an impact on the cultural makeup of the Empire and the influence of Palpatine, but especially the influence of humans, there was a branch of COMPNOR for it. But the organization began far more modestly in size, if not in attitude, as the Commission for the Protection of the Republic, or COMPOr, during the Clone Wars. At this point, COMPOr was essentially just a propaganda arm. It was sponsored by the office of Chancellor Palpatine, giving it some official credence, but it wasn't an official part of the government per se in the way that COMPNOR would turn out to be. Overtly, its mission was to push for greater powers for the Supreme Chancellor to handle the war effort, building support for greater and greater centralization as power shifted from the senators to the Chancellor himself, but also to a lesser extent to the early versions of the Moffs. Less openly, COMPOr was one of the key groups through which pressure was applied to launder latent anti-alien sentiment by couching it in opposition to the mostly non-human-led Confederacy of Independent Systems, and then transform that anti-alien bias into official policy, building towards the humanocentric policies of the Imperial New Order. But one of their big responsibilities was to gather support for the war effort. So a celebration of Republic victories was organized at the recently reopened Monument Plaza on Coruscant, which had been closed after there were some threats to blow it up. This was specifically organized by the the youth wing of COMPOr called the Sub-Adult Group. And among the celebration was the recitation of ancient pre-Republic Coruscanti poetry, but also a quote-unquote brigade leader of the SAG named Tion from the ancient human stronghold of Liana in the Tion cluster, quoting an ancient emperor from the Atrisi system on corruption, saying, quote, "Even the greatest of trees can rot from within, but the vigilant gardener keeps attentive to the signs of decay. The gardener is not afraid to cut through the polished skin to tear away a malignant heart to save the life of that tree. Those who seek shade under that tree would best remember the work of the gardener," end quote. So with this pretty fashy rhetoric, it quickly became clear what COMPOr considered the rot. Recently appointed First Minister of Ingress, Tanin Praji, basically the Coruscant immigration manager, was pressured by COMPOr to move from his already heavily criticized policy of blocking refugees from Coruscant towards expulsions of beings belonging to species whose homeworlds had aligned with the Separatists, with no distinction seemingly even being made on whether they had even come from those planets directly themselves. As a blanket policy, the article Tinker Tailor Soldier Praji says this was largely unenforceable, but it still resulted in the deportation of billions of Aqualish, Gossams, and members of other species from the planet. The Holonet reports on the SA Group's rally in Monument Plaza also mentioned media reports on the overwhelmingly human membership of the SA Group, with one of Palpatine's advisors, who was heavily involved with COMPOr, Croya Vandron, calling allegations of humanocentrism, quote, "sensationalist nonsense. These echelons that gathered today mark the first generation of the SA Group brigadiers. We cannot help that the first to join happen to be of human descent. We have non-human applicants, to be sure. Their applications are still under review." Luckily, their applications to like and subscribe on this video were not under review, meaning they and also you can do that right now. Ultimately, only about 5% of COMPOr's members were non-human, and all of those were members of near-human species. Despite programs like the Cash for Clones drive under the SAG, which we don't get more of an explanation of beyond the name, and the general idea that COMPOr existed to promote the war effort, there were still some tensions between the clone troopers and COMPOr. The SAG would have been prime recruiting ground for non-clone soldiers, at least for the members who became old enough during the Clone Wars, and many of them would become old enough soon after while the Empire was phasing out the clone troopers and trying to recruit other members, generally humans, to replace them. The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, although it's a canon book rather than legends, goes into a bit more depth on how COMPNOR would have worked into the educational programs within the Empire. So while the book technically doesn't apply in this continuity, I think it explores parts of COMPNOR that we never really get explored in the Legends continuity, at least as far as some of the specifics go, so I do think there's some value in talking about it when talking about COMPNOR. But while the Grand Army of the Republic was still in place and there were some members of COMPNOR that were working alongside the clones, it was clear that COMPOR ultimately had about as little respect for the clone army they claimed to support as they did for the aliens they wanted to deport. The novel Order 66 by Karen Travis details an encounter between Nullarch Ordo and an ensign from COMPOR. Rather than referring to Ordo and the other Nullarchs by their actual ranks, this particular COMPOR member just shouted clone at them repeatedly to get their attention, and when informed about how inappropriate his behavior was, the COMPOR member just said that he's a clone, he can't talk to him like that. Ordo then also remarks, at least internally, COMPOR were strutting little twerps who wanted firm government as long as it was imposed on lesser beings and not them. As the Republic turned into the Empire and COMPOR turned into COMPNOR, the ideologues, as Ordo called them, didn't need to enlist in the regular army anymore. COMPNOR developed its own paramilitary group, COMPForce, which embedded its members in the military hierarchy and other places in the Empire, essentially acting as purity police for the New Order, much to the chagrin of other members of the Empire. COMPNOR as a whole was becoming a much more official organ of the government, and it also included the newly formed Imperial Security Bureau, or ISB, an offshoot from Imperial Intelligence, which also included the reluctant former Coruscant Anti-Terrorism Unit. These reforms were overseen by several individuals who would rise very high into the Imperial hierarchy, including the already highly placed Janus Gradatus, an advisor to Palpatine, Artus Kane, the future Grand Moff and leader of the Pentastar Alignment Warlord state, who directly spearheaded the reforms to COMPNOR and who, thanks to some ambiguously worded passages in the Despoilers of an Empire series, may also have been a founding member of COMPOR. There was also the future Grand Admiral Ishin Ilraz, whose political fervor elevated him to that rank rather than any actual military skill or experience. While COMPOR was already technically just made up of the political hardliners, members like Enix Devian, another future warlord, started pushing this even farther than it was already going. Devian joined the ISB where, quote, Devian's flair for brutally ferreting out any deficiency of jingoism disgusted party founder Artus Kane, beginning a lifelong feud. However, his rabid behavior also garnered party leader Croya Vandrin's approval and ultimately Palpatine's personal notice. So while the support for Palpatine was a means to get the kind of jingoism and humanocentrism that the members wanted, being an effective and highly placed member within COMPNOR was also a way to get the attention of Palpatine and have him potentially promote you to an even higher position, which both Kane and Ilraz are good examples of. Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire also mentions a Legends character named Kinman Doriana from Outbound Flight as having been a leading member of COMPNOR. Given that we don't know what happened to Kinman Doriana between the Clone Wars and his eventual death, and that he was already such a close associate of Palpatine's even 10 years before the Clone Wars, I do think the choice of putting him as a highly placed COMPNOR member makes sense. But ultimately our focus is on COMPOR rather than COMPNOR, so that's where we'll leave it for now. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.